Hi guys, welcome back to How to Play Against Hanging Pawns Part 2. So, here we have another very nice game, Ivanchuk versus Aronian. We will look through the opening phase very quickly. So, it was semi-slow, the sharpest opening, but right now e3, knight bd7, and we're in Maran. Queen c2 and anti-Maran. Bishop d6, b3. Of course, here are many lines, but we'll not discuss it right now. Castle, bishop e2, b6, castle, bishop b7, bishop b2, rook c8, and rook ac1. So here Aronian played c5 right away. There are many plans. First, black puts the queen on e7 or on c7 and rook f d8. But of course c5 right away exists, so dc5 was played in the game. bc5, rook f d1, queen e7, and Ivanchuk here made a very good move. g3. What is the idea of g3? You might think that at some point g3 is a weakness, and after some dc4 this bishop will be very strong on this diagonal. But no, g3 is connected to knight h4, and after cd5, ed5, there are threats of knight f5. For example, here if dc4, then simple bc4, rook f d8, and there are several maneuvers with bishop a1 and playing on b file, knight d2, and exchanging the bishop via f3. But let's see what happened in the game, because yet we are not in the hanging pawn position. Rook f d8, cd5, ed5, and here the structure of hanging pawn is on the board. Knight h4, the idea which was foreseen by playing g3. Bishop b8 and bishop f1. A very natural move, putting the bishop either on h3, either on h2. So, knight e5. This is a little inaccuracy to allow white to play bishop h3. I think better was to play queen e6 to prevent the bishop on h3, and in case of bishop g2, just normal moves like h6 is possible, or also rook e8. But let's see how the game continued. Knight e5 and bishop h3. Rook c7, and now bishop g2. What is the idea of bishop g2? Well, idea is obvious, to put pressure on d5 pawn, but why provoking rook c7? Cannot black play here rook cd7? Actually, black cannot play rook cd7 here because there is another pawn on c5 which is also hanging after knight a4. And in case of c4, knight f5, queen f8, and f4. Now we see there is a big problem of the knight because it can no more defend the pawn on c4, and the c4 pawn is lost. So bishop g2, and if black plays here c4, then white can go knight to f5, queen f8, and simple knight b5 with tempo and controlling the d4 square at the same time. So we can see a big benefit of the move bishop h3, and so that the rook is on c7. Bishop g2, and Aronian here played d4. Of course, we saw many ideas with crushing d4, but this time it is pretty much early. Probably it was better to go rook cc8 and ask white what is next plan, and well, white can double the rooks and put more pressure on d5 pawn. But after d4, white plays knight f5, queen e8, e d4, c d4, and simple knight d4. Maybe here Aronian wanted to exchange the bishops here and play for the light squares, but actually he cannot make the use of light squares because no tactics connected with rook d4, and queen c6 is working, just because of knight e4. And if queen c2, then there is a back rank problem with rook d8, knight e8, and rook e8 mate. So after king g2, g6 was played, and knight e4. A very nice trick by Ivanchuk. Of course, Aronian could avoid this trick by not playing g6, but anyway, black's position is really bad. So after knight e4, of course, black cannot take rook c2 because of knight f6, and on king f8, just knight e8, rook b2, and a very nice knight e6 tactic again. If f takes e6, rook d8 with a completely winning position for white. So knight e4, queen e7, knight f6, queen f6, queen e2. White has just an extra pawn and pieces in the center and completely winning position. Rook c1, queen d6, and queen e4. Queen in the center controls the white squares, but f4 would probably win on spot here, because after knight d7, knight c6 attacks the rook on d8, and rook f8 is not possible because of knight e7 mate. So the main threat is also knight e7. So queen e4, queen b4, rook c2, f5, queen e2, queen b7, and here a very good knight c6. With the idea, if black takes knight on c6, queen e6 check, king f8, and rook c6. But after knight c6, Aronian played rook e8, king g1, going from the pin, knight f3, queen f3, rook e1, king g2, queen b5. This attack doesn't work, and after simple rook c4, Aronian resigned. So I hope you enjoyed the game, and let's see another example. This is the game of Gulko versus Nigel Short. A4 was played in the game, and here we see the advance of a pawn when the queen is on a6 is pretty bad. In this concrete position, there was a very nice knight c5, which Nigel Short missed and instead played knight e4, queen b5, rook c7, queen b1, knight d6, and bishop g3, rook c6, bishop takes here, rook takes on d6, and a5. Was very complicated game, and it ended in a draw. But Nigel did have a chance to win this game with knight c5. So what is the idea of knight c5? If dc5, which is obvious, rook c5, and we see the threat here, rook a5, to trap the queen, and bishop f6, gf6 doesn't help. Knight d4, just rook a5, queen a5, bishop b takes a5 and c5. Simple queen d5 has a very big advantage. So rook c5, rook e5. There is no more rook a5, but after knight d5, cd5 is kind of obliged, because if rook ce1, then simple knight b4 or knight c7 wins. So cd5, rook c1, rook e1. If knight e1, then we see that this is the only piece on e-file which protects the e1 knight. So, very nice, queen d5. White cannot take on d5 because there is a mate on e1, and after queen e2, queen b3. This is the case when a rook is much better than two pieces. There is also a rook and two pawns, and the passive position of the pieces. So after rook c1, rook e1 is possible, rook e1, knight e1, ed5, and black is having two pawns and a rook into two pieces, and also white doesn't have a coordinated position, and black is simply much better here. Also, after knight c5, queen b5 was not a hope to survive, because after knight d3, black wins an exchange. So, let's see our last example, the game of Gligorich versus Brown. Here we see the hanging pawns, but also an important battery on c-file, so it gives a chance to black to play b5. Here, queen f4 is no good because of queen a3, and queen h4 is not possible because of cd5, ed5, rook c8, rook c8, and queen d6, and white is pretty much active. So b5, provoking the pawn to c5. And now black has a permanent square on d5. h6, h3. In the game was played f4 with the idea of g5, but actually I think that this is a mistake, because after rook e5, g5 doesn't work because of bishop g5, hg5, rook g5, king f8 and queen h5. So now there are horrible threats on back rank, but after queen f7, also queen h6, king e7, and a simple rook g7 wins. So rook e5, queen f7 with the idea of g5, but after rook c1, in the game was played g5, bishop g5, hg5, rook g5, king f8, and here was played rook e4, rook c d8 with a lot of complications, but it's ended in black's favor, though white has a chance here to play queen g4. And what is the idea of queen g4? We'll see after f3, for example, rook e5. So now there are several threats to take the knight and win the queen afterwards, or for example, if black takes on g2, this wins on spot, and if black tries to defend rook c6, then just queen h4, and the king is really very weak. But after h3, black has an opportunity to play queen f4 right now, offering to exchange queen f4, knight f4, and rook c2. Black has a very good square on d5. It might be very difficult to win this position, but for sure it's pleasant to play it with black pieces. I hope you enjoyed the examples and hope you learned a lot of things. Thank you for watching.